over the years, many years in fact, with the volunteers of the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Company. And some of these individuals have been volunteering this park for over 35 years. And we believe in the story so much to put that story back in the landscape. That's the purpose of offering these programs. So real quick, I just want to make something very clear. A living history program is not what other people would consider a reenactment. If you're expecting hand-to-hand combat today, if you're expecting bullets flying around, guns firing, that kind of stuff, there's none of that today. What we're presenting is called a living history presentation, which means telling the story of the dead. Public history breathes life back into the dead. We're sharing the perspectives of people from 1859 and thereafter as a reaction to John Brown's raid. Here's an example. The town that you just stepped into here in 1859 has a big gun factory across the street. It's the heartbeat of this community. And so if anything happens to the gun factory, if you work there, you're out of a job. Look where you are, 60 miles outside of the capital city. What I'm trying to tell you is this is the sticks of Virginia. You're out in the countryside and you're part of a state called Virginia, the largest slaveholding state in the Union. That's the state that you're in. Right there is Maryland, just like it is today. But West Virginia doesn't exist yet. So the community here is, I'll give you a couple of stats real quick. 3,000 people call this place home. 150 people here are enslaved. 150 are not, they are free. Here's how it works here in Virginia. If somebody gets their freedom, the Commonwealth says you have a year and a day to get out of here. Why doesn't the Commonwealth want you to stay once you get your freedom? What could you possibly do? You can start earning an income. You can start purchasing your family members that are also enslaved, get them into freedom. But here's how you're allowed to stay. Virginia Code back then, 1860, said that if you're free, you have to pick someplace in your community a white sponsor. You need to go to the court 7 miles from here in our county seat with that white sponsor, and you sign on with the court that that person kind of keeps an eye on you. That's how freedom works here in Virginia. If you won't take the white sponsor, the Commonwealth of Virginia says they have the right to put you right back on the auction block a year and a half after you get your freedom and sell you back into slavery. This is 1859. John Brown, that man that's on fire, that man that says it's wrong for one person to own another, has just chosen Harpers Ferry to start his revolution. He wants to attack the gun factory. We've got 100,000 weapons right around the corner there. He hopes to pass out to supporters. He's brought 21 raiders with him from their hideout over there on the Maryland side, 5 miles back up that mountain range called Elk Ridge, Maryland. He comes down the community under the cover of darkness on a Sunday night, coming right across the bridge right here. Remember, this is Arsenal Square. Let's put this building back. It belongs right there where you see the obelisk. Like ground level. There's no embankment behind at the time. You could have seen the Potomac River from where you are right now. Brown comes by in a wagon. He pulls up to the gates at the front of that gun factory. There's only one night watchman on duty on 6 acres worth of a factory. The gates are locked, and Brown shakes the gate and calls the man out of this building. And when he comes up to that lock gate, one man on one side, Brown on the other, Brown says, "I am here from Kansas, and I have just come here to free the slaves. And if anyone interferes with me, I will burn your town, and I will have blood." The perspective of the dead. That's our purpose here in the National Park Service. We're putting air back in their lungs today. And the perspective of this community is that we have 150 enslaved that might be joining John Brown, or they might not. We have 150 that are free. John Brown wants to tap into that, if possible. In steps the Marines and their perspective and their story today, that they're going to share. Tom Williams and the Marines have been with us for many years telling the story. You're in for a treat. Thanks, guys.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing this afternoon? Outstanding. Outstanding. As Mel said, like I say, I'm a retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant, Tom Williams. Like that, I'm Director of Operations for Historic Programming for the Marine Corps through the Marine Corps Historical Company. We're here to tell today, myself and my fellow interpreters and Marines, I'm going to tell you a story that's pivotal to hear John Brown. As I stand before you, I'm no longer a modern citizen. I'm the effigy of a Marine, my counterpart that would have been standing here over 160 years ago in Harpers Ferry. And as Mel said, today we're going to speak. We're going to talk about a very intelligent but very complicated man, John Brown. We're going to talk about the choices he made, the decisions he made, and ultimately all the people that he would interact with here at Harpers Ferry. Before we get started, I'm going to kind of let the groundwork a little bit, and I'm going to make you, the audience, work with me a little bit. I'm going to ask you to use a tool that I'm sure all of you brought with you, and most of you have probably started to learn how to use that tool. You know what that tool is? That brain housing group sitting on top of your shoulders. I'm going to ask you to think like that. So the first thing I'm going to ask you like that is, what is history? Anybody? Is it just the past? History is ongoing. Like, see, 5 minutes from now, what we're talking about will be history. I like that. And history is made by what? Did this building make history? No, it didn't. Like that. We make history. We as a society, we as individuals, and the choices we make history. And more importantly, when we start thinking about history, there's two different sides to history. One is what we call historical facts. And that means points about an individual, about a site, about an incident that we can all agree on. But the other side of that coin that sometimes we have a tendency to ignore is historical truth. And what is historical truth? It's your individual point of view. And what we're going to try to do today through the mouths and through the viewpoints of characters that actually were involved in the raid that took place here in 1859 is look at those various points of view. And you, our visitors, like that, we'd like you to listen to all sides, listen to each of these points of view, and like that, this very interesting and very complicated man called John Brown, and those people that interacted with him and reacted to the raid, and like that, only you can decide what you think might have John Brown. What you will start with it for us as the United States Marines. We do not get involved in this incident until very much late in the game. To start off with, like that, it was only the local citizens that were involved in the raid and to progress, and then more and more people as the scope of the raid would expand, would be brought in. And the Marines only at the end of this process would be brought in and ultimately be the person that would capture John Brown. But this is not where it started. I'm going to turn you over to a gentleman now, Mr. Larry Bob, that's representing Lewis Washington, one of the citizens here at Harpers Ferry, and eventually would be taken hostage by John Brown. And he'll set the groundwork and talk into one of the perspectives through the eyes of the citizens here at Harpers Ferry.
Gunnery Sergeant Winston. I represent Lewis Washington. He was the great-grandnephew of George Washington. I have a house 5 miles from here. And on the night of October 16th, I retired for the night when suddenly my bedroom door was beat upon. And when I opened the door, I was met by a weight of black men carrying guns, shoving them in my face and telling me that I was down there in prison. I was a hostage of John Brown. I heard of John Brown through newspapers, but never seen the man or anything. I wondered why me. As it was, I also recognized one of these white men that was there as a man named John Cook. John Cook had lived in Harpers Ferry for at least a year, and I had met him on one occasion. We got along pretty well, and I brought him to my home. And we even went outside and behind the house and fired some guns together. And in the course of that socializing, I had shown him some artifacts that belonged to George Washington, among which was a sword, George Washington, and a pistol that was given to him by the Marquis of Lafayette. And we parted friends. And now here he was with a gun pointed at me. He told me that he wanted that sword and he wanted that gun. I had to give it over to him. And I was able to hand it back in my wagon and started to haul me down here to Harpers Ferry. On the way, we stopped at my neighbor John Olsen, as well as his young son, and several of his slaves as well. And we finally got here to the ferry. And when I got here to the ferry, that's when I first met John Brown. And lo and behold, now he was wearing my sword. And he told me as Washington wore that sword to free a nation, he was wearing that sword to free the black people. Noble thought. And that he was there to get the arms out of the armory as much as he could, and that he would free slaves and arm those slaves, and then they would go up into the mountains and create the slave army. That they would pick up more and more as they went, sweep down to the south, the slave army freeing more and more people and arming them until this army finally wiped slavery out of the South completely. This was his grandiose plan. He informed me that he had tried through peace by preaching, failed. He had tried to get rid of slavery by warfare out in Kansas, and that failed too. And now he was putting this plan into action. And I found out how it started. It turned out they came from the Kennedy farm over here where they rented a house. They came over the night of October 16th, crossed the railroad bridge. The watchman of the place was civilians who were unarmed. They overpowered the first car with no problem at all. When they got to the other side, that particular watchman panicked and ran. His name was Patrick Higgins. They fired a shot at him and grazed his skull. Didn't kill him, but certainly woke him up. And one other people that came down at that time to see what was going on was a free black man named Hayward Shepherd. He was a porter here to help people with their bags whenever a train came into town. And when he saw men with guns, he also panicked and ran, and one of those men shot him in the back. And that wound would turn out to be mortal. At 3 o'clock the next day, he would pass to the great beyond. So the first person killed in this raid was a free black man. Kind of ironic. Hayward was a good man. I remember him well. As it turned out, Brown then divided his men. He said part of his men up here along the Shenandoah to go to the Virginia Island, where the Hall Rifle Works was, to get guns from there. The other men went up here to the armory grounds to try to get as many weapons as they could from the armory. They got no guns from the armory. Turned out that there was another rumor of an impending flood coming, and they had moved all completed guns all the way up to the other end of the armory into a building that Brown was unaware of. They succeeded in getting the guns down at Virginia Island in the Hall Rifle. And they were taking those guns in a wagon over across the Maryland so they could have those to arm slaves. He also had several hundred pikes made because he knew that in the South, black people were not allowed to have firearms. So maybe they'd be able to handle a pike instead. So this would be a temporary weapon that he would give these people. Then things started to go wrong. First of all, a mail train came through. Brown wanted that train to continue on. It was just to make a very quick stop, drop off the mail, pick up things back, and move on. So Patrick Higgins saw that train coming, and he saw a chance to try to get some help. And he flagged the train down and told them there were hundreds of raiders here, both white and black, and they had taken over the town and were threatening to even burn the town if there was any interference. And now Brown came down and told the conductor, he said, "You should move this train, I want you out of here." And the conductor was afraid to move it because he had no idea what these raiders had done something to the crossing. The last thing he wanted to happen was to have damage done to his train, particularly to the passengers on that train. So he refused to move it until daylight and he could see what was going on. While all this was happening, there were men coming to the armory to work. And as they arrived, they were taken hostage. So eventually there were at least 40 of us in the armory yard that were now held hostage. And they told me that I'm the chief hostage because of my Washington name, And if there's ever any bargaining to be done, I'm the one that they're going to put up for collateral. Great feeling. Now that shooting that took place woke up some other people as well. One of those was Dr. John Starry. And he came down and he saw Hayward wounded, lying on the porch of the train station, and tended to him as best he could, but realized there was not much he could do, so he made him comfortable. And somehow he was able to steal away. And he managed to get his horse, and he became the Paul Revere of Harpers Ferry. As he got that horse and rode through the community, awakening the militia everywhere they went. And so the militia began to mobilize. While that was going on, some other town people had awakened, and now you had raiders and townspeople shooting at each other, and eventually there would be townspeople killed and raiders killed. I can't go into detail here. And it's starting to get more deadly. Right, so now the militia is going to be mobilized. Well, with the militia, you have these various towns all outlying in different areas. And of course, they have to have a common place to meet. Each of them met at one common place in the town. That common place was the most common area that people would gather in any town at that time. And that was the tavern. You got it. Now, not everybody arrives exactly at the same time. So when you get there and the barman says, hey, you like to drink while you're waiting? So they did. And unfortunately, there would be quite a few of these men who were half-tooted before they even got started on their mission. And yet, when daylight came, a number of things happened. First of all, the conductor and John Brown himself walked across the trestle in front of the train, allowing it to go through. While they were walking, Brown bragged to the conductor that he had at least 200 white men and just as many black men with him in this raid. And so the conductor got on his train, they headed on, and as soon as they got to the very first town that had a working telegraph, it wasn't cut by Brown's men, he immediately sent a message off to Washington saying hundreds, if not thousands, of raiders were here in Harpers Ferry. You can imagine how that was received in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, the militia actually put together a pretty good plan. They crossed over the Shenandoah Bridge. They had one group attack the Hall Rifle Works, and at the same time the other group came down the Maryland side along the Potomac and crossed over the railroad bridge and attacked the town from this end. So now you've got militia coming in from two sides after the raiders. And now there's people shot and killed on both sides as things get even more problems. Now, during this, Brown had chosen the engine house. This engine house was a firehouse that protected the armory. The town had its own firehouse. This was strictly for the armory itself. It was the smallest building of the complex, the easiest one to defend. And so he moved the men he had with him, and he only had a few left at that time with him, moved into this engine house. He took the hostages with him, put 30 of them here in the watchman's shed, and took 10 of us, including myself and some slaves, into this part of the building. And kept us there again for bargaining chips. Now the militia kept firing at us and everything. And Brown had 2 of his sons with him, and both of them were shot. And both of them were mortally wounded. And as the day went on, he tried all kinds of things to try to get out of there, tried to negotiate with the militia. Everything failed. And eventually it got towards nightfall. And we saw men in uniforms, first uniforms we had seen, and it turned out they were the militia from Frederick, Maryland. It turned out they had gotten hold of Washington, and the president had federalized them and allowed them to cross over state lines. And so they relieved the Virginia militia and surrounded the engine house. And of course, the Virginia militia went into the town section where we are now, where all the bars and hotels were open. So you know what's going on there. And meanwhile, we're caught in this engine house, wondering what's going to happen to us. And Brown negotiated with the captain of the Frederick militia to send in a doctor to look after his sons. And the doctor came in, and the doctor and me tried our best to get Brown to surrender and give this thing up before they were all killed and before any of us got hurt. But he refused to listen to us. And so we would have to spend the rest of the night in there, wondering, is there ever going to be any federal involvement in this? What is Washington going to do for us?
164 years ago, my predecessor would be Orderly Sergeant McDonough, senior non-commissioned officer at the Marine Barracks in Washington. The morning of the 17th, as I would arise and such like that, I figured it would be another normal day at the barracks. A drill, guard duty, and normal routine. Little did I know that eventually we'd be facing the first action that the Marines had seen in a while. But in retrospective, nothing happens in a vacuum. If all that you just heard would be happening here in Harpers Ferry alone, we have to start looking now what's happening in the big picture. As Blues Washington would say, like that, word had gotten to the President and the Secretary of War, like that hundreds if not thousands of insurrectionists like that had started a raid against the town of Harpers Ferry and of the Arctic complex. President Buchanan knew we had to do it. I would not find this out until much later, way above my pay grade. But as the word trailed back, this would start letting me know the key players I would eventually be working with. Like that. As the word got to Washington like that, the first thing the President knew he had to do. He did not necessarily want to send federal troops to Harpers Ferry. This was a Virginia issue. I say, but because of federal property here, it felt it was a necessity to send federal troops back as an interdiction force to at least look out for the best interests of the federal arsenal and such. Like I said, as the word would come in, like that, he needed a senior officer to come down of the United States Army to interact with the militia and like that and look after these properties. Ironically, at that time period, the entire strength of the United States Army was less than 16,000 men. All of those were on the Western Territories or forts, depending on our coastal fortifications. We as Marines would rotate through various Navy yards, such as the Marine Barracks and Navy Yard at Washington like that, and also be working on ships. Ironically, we would be sucked into a land operation because there was no available United States Army troops. First thing would happen like that, the President wanted to find an officer to be in charge of this operation, but believe it or not only were there no federal troops or even militia prior to this raid here at Harpers Ferry, there was no regular Army troops in Washington, D.C. There were no senior officers available in Washington, D.C. But by chance and sheer luck, the right person in the right place at the right time, a young lieutenant colonel named Robert E. Lee, that happened to be in his home in Arlington. He had been in, like say, New York on the court-martial detail and had taken furlough and stopped off in his home in Arlington and like that on his way back to his command. He was second in command of the 2nd United States Cavalry, then in San Antonio, Texas. He happened to be in Washington like that and would end up being picked as the man to lead this operation. In the same War Department office, as the word got to the Secretary of War, there was another character that would come into play, a young lieutenant of dragoons named J.E.B. Stewart. He would gain great fame later on in the war that was pursued this. He, being a typical cavalryman, he was there on furlough himself, like that, having been stationed in Kansas. This would come in, as you heard before, like that, would wonder about getting on the action. He would hear what was going on, typical cavalry of the period. I smell action, I want to be involved. So he would volunteer to go to fetch Lee to be briefed by the President. Meanwhile, they need to figure out where are the troops coming from. The closest United States Army troops would be heavy artillery and Fort Monroe artillery. It would take them well over 2 days by barge to even get to Washington, D.C. The Secretary of the War would reach out to the Secretary of the Navy, like that, to raise the Marines. There was a detachment of a company strength Marines, about 86 souls, like that, at the Marine Barracks of Washington at the Navy Yard. The Commandant of the Marine Corps that would be living there would be notified, and the ground Marines. This was my character would come into play. Sergeant Major McDonald, like it would be briefed by a young lieutenant, the officer of the day, named Israel Green, like that would eventually lead the detachment Marines to come down. We would mobilize this Marine force, draw ammunition, and prepare for action. For many of the Marines, they were very excited about this because peacetime guard duty and like that and garrison duty became very mundane, very boring, and every Marine was anxious to go. Again, like Jeb Stewart, they smelled action. So we rallied the Marines, the Marines like that, and Green was not going to wait like that. He would be the senior officer, and ironically, again, the right players in the right place at the right time. Not only was Green an experienced Marine officer in 12 years, he was also a trained artillery. So this allowed the Marines to draw 2 cannon to take with them. But again, hundreds of raiders. They had no idea what they're going to get into, so they wanted to go prepared no matter what the situation was. Very quickly, like I say, we were joined by another officer, Major Russell, the paymaster of the Marine Corps, was joined us. But ironically, because of the system at the time, Major Russell was an appointed staff officer, which means by law he could not command troops. So he would inadvertently end up going as a liaison, not to command the troops, that would say was Green, but as a liaison between the Army officer that would be assigned to the operation and Lieutenant Green in charge of Marines. This would become a joint services operation. Very quickly, Lieutenant Green rallied these men, prepared to march, like that, and they didn't wait. They immediately went to the train station like that, and by 3 p.m., we were on the road heading for Harpers Ferry. But we could not take a direct route. One of the problems was train gauges had not been standardized. So we had to take a train to Baltimore, where we would be joined by 2 more companies out of Maryland, Baltimore Militia. Like to board the train, we would board a second train, and by 8 o'clock in the evening, we would arrive here at Sandy Hook, just on the other side of the river. While that was happening, Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart were then being briefed by the President. The President knew it was a very dire situation and was briefing Lee that this was very delicate. He would not only have to be an Army officer, he would also have to work as a negotiator. And like that, and as a politician, like to be working with the representatives of both Maryland and Virginia to resolve this situation. He was not to intervene unless necessary. He did have in his pocket, when he left the President, a real letter saying that he could declare martial law if necessary, but was not to do so unless in the last resort. Let the state handle the situation as best they could. Like at that point, we arrived at Sandy Hook. Green, being a very prudent officer, would send myself and a few other Marines across while they were waiting for Robert E. Lee to show up at the special train. We would come across the river that night, survey the situation, and as normal like that, everything was not what it seemed. Like that, the word that would get to Washington was an exaggeration of that, and we found there was only 2 insurrectionists that like that were involved in the raid. But there were well over 2,000 people, both militia and civilians, that gathered here at Harpers Ferry. As Mr. Washington stated, like that, because they were frustrated because they had no way of getting into the Young House, it was developed into a stalemate. We couldn't get in, Brown and his people could not get out, and like that, so nobody knew what to do. And what are they doing? They're sitting in the taverns, very frustrated. You have firearms, alcohol, and really a lot of bad attitudes. And this is the situation that Robert E. Lee lived. And the senior enlisted man, this is one time I would not be the one to be the officer in charge. Because Robert E. Lee would have some very hard choices, very hard decisions to make as we move forward. As we got here, Lee would finally arrive. About 1 o'clock in the morning, he would draw the rest of the Marines out. I would brief him on the situation, tell him what was going on. He would survey and make a decision. At that point, he would take the Marines, have Lieutenant Green replace all the militiamen inside armory grounds, like that was federal property, to replace them with regular forces, our Marines. At that point, he would look at Colonel Lee would look at Lieutenant Green and says, start formulating the rescue plan against this building where we're told that the insurrectionists are where the raiders are, like that, but do not move. Like that, I'll talk to you about it later. Now, Lee would have to turn into a politician. He had to deal with both Maryland and Virginia militia. Again, at the time, he was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. There was a full bird colonel from Maryland and a full bird colonel from Virginia that were on site. At that time, although we did not have constitutional autonomy like that, federal troops could operate on home territory. But in this situation, the militia officers of that particular state had authority over the federal forces. So even if Robert E. Lee had been a full bird colonel, he could not supersede the authority of the colonel from Virginia especially. So what he would have to do before he could take any actions other than provide support, he would have to find out the situation and the disposition of the militias and what these militia officers wanted to do. So he'd first approach, like say the colonel of militia like that from Maryland, says, you were the first uniformed troops out here, you were criminalized, arrived on the site, like that, do you want the privilege and honor of releasing the hostages and capturing John Brown? And they did know who the man was at that time. Now, there's a lot of controversy back and forth of what the actual reply was from the Maryland colonel, but ultimately the decision was made. So Maryland came here to support Virginia this is a Virginia problem like that, and it should go to the Virginia militia to rescue the hostages. At this point now, we do have documented like that, and I was with Colonel Lee, like when he approached the colonel of the Virginia militia, and asked him, do you want the honor of assaulting an Indian house? These are your friends, your neighbors that are being held hostage. I'm sure your militia would want to be the ones to have the honor to rescue these hostages. Well, the response was from the Virginia militia colonel. It says, no, you're the paid mercenaries, you're the paid professionals, it's your responsibility. And like I said, we can only guess what the Virginia colonel was thinking, but to surmise it, we believe the idea that, like I say, yes, they were his friends, his neighbors, and the people that voted him into office that were in that engine house. And if you can imagine that time, what's going through his mind, his militiamen are not trained for an operation like this. We as Marines would have better experience in doing it. Plus, politically, if we turned it over to the federal forces to assault the engine house, if the Marines would fail in their duty, if my Marines couldn't accomplish tasks of rescuing the hostages, then he could point a finger and blame us, federal forces, interfering with Virginia ideals. So like I say, it was a very tenuous position. So he put Robert Lee in the spot. Lee then says, okay, now we have to come up with a plan how we're going to do it. We now have the authority to do it. What's going to happen next? So we told Lieutenant Green, and I would have my Marines distributed. We'd come up with 2 assault teams, 12-man team that would stand right off the corner of the building here. They would drop their overcoats and go in. But there was one caveat that Colonel Lee that would give us. And that was strange at the time, but we would understand it as we were briefed on our orders. Our Marines were to go in unloaded. Their weapons were to be unloaded. As you see these Marines over here, the primary weapon they would focus on would be that 16 inches of cold steel, the bayonet. Now, Brown and his people had better weapons than we as Marines had at that time. They had breech-loading carbines. Now we come into play. And why would we go in unloaded? As you can imagine, it's dark, it's dank, it's raining. We would still have to wait for sunlight. And how would we tell friend and foe? Like I say, both the civilian hostages were held like it would be in contemporary civilian clothing, and Brown's raiders were in the same type of civilian clothing. The only way we could tell who was the enemy and like who we were fighting like that, if they had a gun pointed at us, then we would have to assault them. If they had their hands in the air, we would hope they were friendly. And this was the confusion that these Marines would have to go into. At that point, Lee now had the authority, an assault plan, like the additional 12 men would be lined up on this side, and like that, 2 more Marines we would select with the sledgehammers that were gone from the arsenal, 18 pounds apiece, they would use to batter the door down. The problem is, we could not see in. We didn't know what the disposition of the forces were. We didn't know what was going on the inside or where everybody was. So we would have to come up with a plan. At this point, though, we really didn't know what's going to happen, so we had to come up with a assault plan. Lee wanted to wait until sunrise before they would make the assault in the engine house like that. But with all this going on like that, I knew what I was going through my mind and led through Colonel Lee's mind and such like that. We'd brief on our orders and like that. But who was this man that was leading this raid against Harpers Ferry? Who were we going to be assaulting? What was going through his mind at the time?
Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that the power of government derives from the people. That is to say that the people give to their government whatever power it wields to serve and protect its citizens. Mr. Jefferson continues saying that whenever a government becomes abusive of that power, it is not only the right but the duty of the people to take back that power and either force the government to change or give that power to a new government that is more amenable to their needs and wishes. Slavery, people held in bondage against their will, is a sin against God and all mankind. And any government that styles itself a democracy, that condones, supports, protects, finances, and practices slavery is an abomination. It is abusing the power that its people have given to it. I brought my men into town 2 days ago in an attempt to seize back some of the power that we had given to our government and forced it to change its policy on slavery. We are on a holy mission to remove the stain of the sin of slavery from the soul of our nation. Right away, things began going wrong. The townspeople put up more resistance than we expected. The militia mustered much more rapidly than we had anticipated. Yes, and as they gathered, they began searching for their courage in the bottom of a bottle and became drunk and rowdy. They began hunting down small groups of my men and slaughtering them in an orgy of bloodlust. And last, the slaves never did rise up in support. Understandably, perhaps out of fear of what their masters might do to them if they were caught. Eventually, I and a few of my men, for all I know, all that was left of my original company of 20, were forced to take refuge in this firehouse. I sent two of my sons out to negotiate food for our prisoners. They were shot down in the street like one would a rabid dog. One died instantly, the other died in my arms a few hours later. All night long we listened to the drunken revelry around us, watching for a chance to escape. None ever presented itself. Occasional outbursts of gunfire up in the town gave us hope that possibly some of my men had rallied and were attempting a rescue. But that didn't happen. Then, near dawn, everything became quiet. We began noticing that the militia surrounding us was being relieved by regular troops. United States regular troops. Where had they been that they could get here so quickly? But then came a new hope. We to be captured and arrested by federal troops. They might be able to protect us from the mob. Rather than being slaughtered in our body and dragged through the streets of drunken revelry, we might be able to tell our story to the world and let the world judge on the merits of our actions. But if the fates decree that we decide that if the fates decree that we should be killed at the hands of federal troops, our deaths would be honorable. They would be fraught with meaning. Our blood would mingle with that of the millions who had died before us in bondage and return in a great flood that would finally purge this guilty nation.
Very dynamic and compelling point of view. Something as a Marine NCO I wouldn't learn about until weeks later as John Brown would suffer the time. At this point the stage was set. We know the adversaries are going to be involved. Robert E. Lee was going to try one more time to prevent any further bloodshed. My Marines were in place, the assault team was ready to go, literally standing right off the corner of the building. The reserve force would be standing off the other corner of the building. Lieutenant Green would be standing right with the assault force, all with Major Russell. He was going to try to make the assault as well. But Lee would first try to basically get John Brown to surrender. He would write a note, and to paraphrase what that note said, he would ask Brown, if you surrender to the federal authorities, to my troops, like that, we'll do everything in our power to guarantee your safety. But Jeb Stewart was to deliver that note, but in reality he was told, do not negotiate with John Brown. It's either a yes or no answer. If you look at the building, which you would have seen in 1859, this pillar had a loophole, a slit cut in that they shoot through like that to shoot through. That would come into play. Lieutenant Stewart was told that you would bring this note to John Brown and you couldn't see what was on the inside. And these are firehouse doors. They weren't designed to keep people out. So what Brown had done is run ropes across the inside of the door, latching them to keep them from springing open. Brown could see through that. They could also see through the loophole. But they couldn't see what's going on either side of them. Like, so they couldn't even see the Marines that lined up to prepare for the assault. As daylight came about, Stewart would come up with a note. Advance to, because this door only, knock on it. John Brown himself would open the door cracking like that. Stewart read the note, Brown would read it, and like that, and then he would try to negotiate. Give me time, give me 5 minutes leave, like that. Stewart would have no part of it. He would step back right here, lean below the loophole, and tip his hat as a signal of assault like that to Lieutenant Green Smith. At that point, Lieutenant Green and my Marines would rush forward. Like I said, they would start using the sledgehammers to beat down the door. But unfortunately, physics being what it was, like that, the ropes would start acting as springs. They would absorb the shock of the sledgehammers. At the same time, this is happening, a shot ring out. And we believe that John Brown himself had shot through this loophole and mortally wounded like that my Marine, Luke Wynn. And he was dropped to the ground here. At that point, Lieutenant Green realized this is not working. He stepped back. Ironically, there was construction going on, like that roof repair going on to the building right next door, and a 20-foot ladder, very similar to what you see against the bulkhead here, would be leaning up to the next building. He would have the reserve force ground arms immediately rush over, grab that ladder, but instead of going to the center of the door, he would turn around and have the Marines assault the upper hinge. That was a point that wouldn't give. After 2 solid strikes, that hinge would shear, and all of a sudden the door would not break. The hinge would give way, would twist over the ropes of the lower hinge, creating a triangle opening. Lieutenant Green would immediately rush in over the top of the door, right in front of him was John Brown. The second person being the Russell, he would crawl underneath, and the corporal, Private Rookie, would follow after the be shot in the fall. The rest of the Marines would run in with bayonets. Ironically, if you can imagine inside the engine house, John Brown would be kneeling down. He's in the process now after firing the fatal shot against Luke Wynn, and he's railroading his carbine. Like that, Green would rush in. Remember, he was carrying a ceremonial sword and brought it today. He didn't stop in time before he left to pick up a combat weapon to take with him. He rushed in, he raised his sword to strike down at John Brown. John Brown would throw up his arm to block the sword thrust, and like that, the sword would get hung up and relieve some harness and stuff overhead, and like that, it would be a glancing blow. Then Lieutenant Green would then draw back and go to stab John Brown, killing him outright. But as later he would state, like that, his sword bent. In fact, he said it would bend in half, although it must have been a really cheap ceremonial sword. Typical officer like that didn't want to carry anything heavy. Like that. So he would thrust against John Brown like that, and it hit something. Many myths later on with Bible in Brown's pocket, but as you see, John Brown wasn't wearing a coat at the time, so we believe more likely it was either a cartridge box sling or something. Regardless of what it was, the bayonet would flex, or the sword would flex. So the Lieutenant Green would then come back and start pummeling John Brown using the hilt of the sword as brass knuckles. At the same time, Brown would go to the ground, and like that, another Marine would rush behind and bayonet John Brown in the abdomen. This would be the wound that he would suffer through during the trial. At that point, more Marines would come by, they would bayonet one of the raiders under the engine, another raider was bayoneted against the back wall, and the hostage would leave. The third raider would then step back into among the hostages, drop his weapon, put his hands in here and say, "I'm one of them." And like that, and he would survive the raid. Very quickly, like that, the hostages were released and brought out, and John Brown and the surviving raiders were brought out with him. From the time Lieutenant Stewart would tip his hat to Lieutenant Green, and like that, to the time John Brown was pulled out of the engine house, 3 minutes. 3 minutes. And all of a sudden, it would change us as a society, and what happened here and the choices people make would change us forever as a community. Like that. Ask any people like that would start the rumor like that as we even hear back on the barracks. Okay, this would lead to war. And it would in many cases like that 2 years later lead to war. But not only was the raid important here, what John Brown did with all the participants in this place and their points of view at the time like that would add to the society. What would happen? Like that, Brown would be tried, and he would use the trial as his platform to get his message across. The newspaper across the land would spread his message, and it would polarize us as a society. Like that. Ultimately, unfortunately, 2 years later, because of that polarization, we lost the ability to talk to each other. We started thinking emotionally, and it would lead us into war. Like that. That was a story like that. It literally changed their lives today as a society and history like that. So it shows how important and how relevant history is. It also shows how important it is for we as a society to never ignore the other side, even if we don't agree with their opinions, and be willing to listen. When we stop being willing to listen, we stop talking to each other, there's always going to be bad consequences. So the old adage like that, we must always look at history. When we stop remembering history, the mistakes that were created then, we're doomed to repeat. Like that, so we always have to be constantly aware of that. Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you very much. I'm sure there's a lot of questions you may have. Please feel free to come up and ask.